Hello and welcome to another video. Today I'd love it if you joined me in the English Renaissance with my newest historical project, a Tudor gown. As much as I adore the final product, this was an intensely frustrating project. I opted to work with a pattern that was, to put it kindly, not ideal, and so much of what you see here is my battle with that pattern. Thankfully I persisted and got a satisfactory garment out of the affair, so I suppose all's well that ends well. Now without any further ado, let's get into it. I started with the kirtle. It's a deceptively simple looking garment with its heavy structuring hidden away. To begin construction, I began with 2 of the pattern pieces, center back and center front, and I cut 2 of each from my fabric. For this I knew I'd need some amount of boning, so I decided to use a medium weight thrifted linen for interlining. Please forgive the fact that you can see me cutting these pieces out without pressing the fabric first. There were cats sleeping on it and I didn't have the heart to move them. After cutting out 2 of each of the bodice pieces, I laid these atop the same fabric and top stitched said pieces to another layer of linen. Then I cut away the excess and finally I could give them a good press and ta-da! Here is the foundation of the bodice. The first seam to be tackled was the center back, which got a standard seam. I also pressed this seam open and stitched the allowances down by machine to keep it as flat as possible and to minimize fraying. At this point, I thought I wanted my kirtle to have a front closure, so I added boning channels at the center front and marked between them for eyelets. Next, I marked out the placement of the boning channels. Though the kirtle gives a silhouette not unlike its descendant, early 18th century stays, the boning here is different. At the back, only the center has boning, and even the boning pattern at the front is different, with boning absent at the bust, creating 2 cups. Though this weirded me out, I transferred my initial markings to both center front pieces before machine stitching this line. With this completed, I started top stitching my 1/4 inch boning channels and adding the boning as I went, as I was still experimenting. I also closed the side seams. Again, this ended up being temporary as I opted later for a different closure. After trying on the garment, I had to change the height of these channels a few times before I was happy, but I got there eventually. Here's a part of how that process went. So here's my favorite thing about working with a pattern I've never worked with before, and yes, that's entirely sarcastic. You don't know how it's going to fit. I did this to my measurements. I cut out the pattern that I was supposed to cut out, and I erred on the side of a little large. Now, luckily, the back fit perfectly, so I can leave the back alone, and you'll notice I've stitched these down here. But one thing that I'm going to need to do is to add some more width to the center front, which if you're working with your actual fashion fabric is kind of a disaster if you have to start piecing, but because this is going to be the interlining, it doesn't matter. So I'm going to add a little bit more there, and I'm also going to change the shape of the bust boning, what I'm calling the bust boning, because it was doing some very weird things that I can't show on YouTube to my bust. So, fitting continues. After adding width to the center front, I permanently fixed the straps to the center front pieces. Additionally, I decided I wanted side closures, so I opened the side seams and stitched the center front together. I also marked out and stitched in the boning channels on either side of the eyelets. These bones are important as they distribute the strain of the lacing. After I had added all the bones, I sewed up the bottom edge of the bodice to keep the bones in. I could then mark out the position of the eyelets and open large enough holes so that I could thread a shoelace in each side to try on the garment. Here's what it looked like at this stage. But this wasn't enough structure yet, so I added a layer of buckram. For this, I cut 3 pieces from heavyweight linen, 2 each of the center back and 1 center front, cut over the fold. I stay-stitched, then stiffened them with a xanthan gum paste. I then seamed up the center back but left the straps loose. To fix the buckram layer to the interlining layers, I simply laid them right side to wrong side and top-stitched the 2 layers together, securing the straps at this stage also. Then I punched out the eyelet holes and folded the extra buckram towards the inside, machine stitching it to secure it. Now here's what it looked like. See the difference? Even more structure and the boning lines are smoothed out. Adding the fashion layer was simple. I cut 2 center back pieces and 1 center front, stay-stitched them, and seamed them together at the center back. To attach the satin to the bodice, I put the whole thing on the dress form and laid the satin atop it, wrong side to right side of the buckram. This I do to keep the fit as smooth as possible. What you don't see is that I repeated this process with the lining, albeit not on the dress form. Then it was time to bind the arm size and the neckline. First I cut strips of satin. No, it's not bias cut, I'm not made of money or fabric. Then I bound in the usual way, laying the binding to the raw edge, right sides together, then stitching it down. Subsequently, I flipped the binding over this raw edge, folded its raw edge underneath, and stitched in the ditch to secure. I also hand-worked the eyelets. Sorry I'm not showing that process, but here's a photo of the result. Next up, the kirtle skirt. After cutting out the skirt pieces from both lining and satin, I marked out 10 inches from the top edge of each side seam of the center piece in order to create the plackets to match the side openings. With these marked, I simply seamed each center piece to the side piece, pressing the seam allowance for each placket. Then I attached each side piece to the back pieces, and then the back pieces along the center back seam to one another. I repeated this process for both lining and satin. Then after pressing open the seams, I laid the lining and satin wrong sides together, lining up the plackets and seams, and top stitched them together. This gave me a single skirt piece I could affix to the bodice. To do this, I aligned the skirt center front with the bodice center front, and did the same thing for the center backs and sides. I marked 4 inches from each side opening, and starting at that marking, I knife pleated the center front skirt into the center front bodice. For the side and back panels, affixed to one another, I again knife pleated towards the center back. Next up, the forepart. This was very easy to make. I simply cut out one center front piece from the kirtle pattern, rolled and stitched the edges, bound the hem, and added a waistband with ribbon ties. I likely made it wider than it needs to be, but that's okay. It means I don't have to pin it to my kirtle to keep it from showing under the gown. You'll notice it's made to match the foresleeves. Speaking of foresleeves, these were one of the most fun things to make. This is the one place the pattern needed no adjustment. I simply cut 2 of the single foresleeve pattern piece from velvet, minding the nap, and laid them atop some medium weight linen for interlining. After pinning wrong sides together, I top stitch all the way around the outside, later repeating this process for the lining. After cutting away the excess interlining, I traced the markings for the voids for some poofs and subsequently top stitched these markings too, then cut open the voids and rolled and hand stitched the edges of these openings. After this, I bound all the foresleeves edges in my usual way. First, I pinned strips of fabric to the edge, right sides together, and then I stitched it into place, this time with a 3/8 of an inch allowance. This time I left the pins in as I stitched. Then I folded that binding over the raw edge, folding the binding's raw edge underneath to hide that too. Stitching in the ditch secured the binding and completely finished these edges. I also stitched in the ditch to close up the foresleeve, sewing it 4 points along the bottom edge, matching the buttons I'm using as Tudor ouches, and halfway up along the back. After that, it was time for some poofs. These I made from polyester chiffon, which I did to mimic the fine linen that would have existed in the period. Sadly, you just can't buy linen this fine anymore, so polyester it was. To make the poofs, I simply created chiffon tubes that I could push through the openings between the ouches and through the voids, then stitch in place. I also added some false cuffs, finished with beads to mimic buttons. And with that, the foresleeves were done. The largest piece, physically and emotionally, was the gown. I'll do my very best to show the process, but because there was so much trial and error, and because so many things went wrong at every turn, documenting the process was very challenging. Anyway, the first step was to start with the base pattern, which I ended up having to modify heavily. I started by cutting out 2 of each piece of the bodice section from interlining made of thrifted linen. I did have quite a bit of help for this part of the process, as you'll see. I could then place these pieces atop some heavier linen to create 2 layered interlining. I opted for 2 weights of linen to provide structure, but to try to avoid bulk. As usual, I connected these layers by top stitching within the seam allowance, then by cutting the excess fabric away. This left me with 2 of each of the following pieces: forebody, side front, side back, and center back. Seaming these together was simple-ish. I seamed side pieces together with a seam running under the armpit. Next, I attached the center back pieces to each side back piece. Because the pattern hadn't trued these seams correctly, I later had to trim the pattern pieces to match one another. After this, I also attached the shoulder straps to the side back pieces, then the forebodies to the side front pieces. Finally, I joined the 2 halves together at the center back. And then it didn't fit. At all. So I had to remake the front side pieces and completely redraft the pattern for the forebodies, and then reassemble it, which is what you see now. Next up was to make the front closure. This began with top stitching boning channels, as always, to support the eyelets, the placement of which you can see me marking out here. Subsequently, I started on the sleeves. For these, I used a single layer of interlining, which you can see me attempting to cut here. Emphasis on attempting. I did eventually cut out these pieces, and then seamed each sleeve together, paying special attention to the angle where the fitted part of the sleeve flares out. Clipping this point, as well as the rest of the curve, was also important. I also set the sleeves, which revealed that the pattern had set me up for a roller coaster, so I didn't film my mental breakdown. I then cut out the fashion and lining layers. As I assembled these layers in the same way, I'll just show you the pretty fashion layer. First, I seamed the center back pieces, then the side pieces to one another along that side seam. After that, the side back pieces to each side of the joined center back pieces. With the seams pressed open, this is what it looked like. Finally, I attached the shoulder strap to the body of the garment and the forebodies to each side of the front pieces. Next up, sleeves. The sleeves involve the following layers: fashion, which you are seeing me assemble now, interlining, lining, and turnback. The lining and turnback are a single layer, so the lining is cut to just above the elbow and the turnback is the remaining piece of the sleeve. With the sleeve set, I could sandwich the interlining between the lining and the fashion fabric and top stitch it in place. Additionally, I made and attached the skirts, which was a very similar process to the curl. Panels attached to one another and knife pleated into the bodice. Additionally, I bound all the edges, neckline, front opening, and hem, but opted to leave the skirt unaligned as the darn thing was already so ridiculously heavy. Now back to the sleeves. To finish them, I first cut the turnbacks from this deliciously fluffy faux fur. To achieve the best look, I opted to seam each turnback closed by hand, using a sort of adapted blanket stitch. Then I could stuff each sleeve inside each turnback so right sides were together, pin this in place, and stitch along the cuff by hand, subsequently flipping the turnback inside the sleeve and affixing it to the lining by the same method. At this point the end was nigh, so I worked some eyelets, laced it up, and popped the gown on the dress form to deal with the placard. This I had to draft myself, winging it with the boning placement, and then figure out the best way to affix it to the gown. I opted to flatline the following layers: layers of buckram, a few bones, a layer of linen interlining, and a poly taffeta lining. To affix the purple satin, I laid it right sides with the lined interlining and stitched it down, leaving open the top edge so I could flip the whole thing right way out. This edge I subsequently bound with my standard method. Then it was a matter of affixing the placards. Placards are attached either at one side and pinned at the other, or pinned at both. I opted to attach one side because I simply could not maneuver the pins in on the left-hand side due to the unwieldy nature of this gown. So by hand I slip-stitched the placard down on the left side. And with that, the gown was complete. I made myself some accessories, namely a girdle and a French hood, and then I was finally done and ready to live my dreams of Tudor nobility. Thanks so much for joining me today. If you'd like to see more of my historical work, it can be found on my channel and on my socials. All will be linked in the description box. So until we meet again in the past, the present, or maybe even the future, take care, and I'll see you next time.